Hi, I'm Janelle, the founder of All Things Equitable, and I'm here today with Jared Karol, my next guest in the White and Woke at Work series. And I'm happy to have Jared here with me today. Hi, Jared, welcome.
Hi, Janelle. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Jared Karol is Karol with a K. He is a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging professional who has an anti-racism, I guess, workplace where you educate white people in what they can do to be anti-racist. So you are the perfect guest for this show, Jared.
Sounds like it. Sounds like it.
Tell me a little bit about your personal journey toward anti-racism. I know you guide others to anti-racism, but what I guess, or when did you first, I guess, wake up to the issues with respect to, systemic racism, particularly for Black and Brown people?
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I could fill your whole show times 10 with that journey, right? But I always point to one specific incident. I was probably 23, 24, a couple years out of college. This is in the 90s, so people can do the late 90s. People can do the math if they want to figure out how old I am. Um, I was I was on a bus in San Francisco, the 19 Polk bus actually, and I was visiting my dad. My I grew up in San Diego, went to school in Santa Barbara, very very white places. My whole upbringing was very very white, very homogenous. I was a college athlete, right? So I had this whole scene going. And so anyway, my dad, who was gay, he lived in San Francisco. I was visiting him, and I went on the bus to get to a bookstore, and I was getting a couple books, and he said, "Oh, you should get Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison." I said, "Okay." I
Mhm.
wasn't really much of a reader then, so I go and I get the books. It's like a Thursday night at maybe 9 o'clock or so, and I get back on the bus, and I have a stack of maybe three or four books, and Invisible Man's on the top. So I'm writing down Polk Street.
Mhm.
And for people who know San Francisco, Polk Street goes through the Tenderloin in San Francisco. And
Yep.
so about three stops in, this black man gets on the bus, and it's kind of an empty bus, and he sits down kind of right next to me. There's this row of side-facing seats, and it was kind of strange, maybe that he chose to sit next to me
Mhm.
because the bus was pretty empty. So it's kind of awkward. We're just sitting there in the silence, and maybe a minute later, he says, "That's a great book. It changed my life." And I go, "Oh yeah, my dad suggested that I get it." He's like, "Oh, your dad's a smart man."
Mhm.
So it started a conversation, and he told me all about his life as a black man in America. And of course, I hadn't read the book yet. I don't know if you have, but it's about being an invisible man, a black man being invisible, in America in 40s, 50s. Excuse me. And so I have this incredible conversation with him about uh, he grew up in Harlem, and about San Francisco and suburbs and urban and white and black and music and art and the just this fascinating conversation,
And you're
right? So
on the bus.
I'm on the bus, and just the two of us. There might be like three other people,
Okay.
right? And this is actually a side story, but why I love public transportation too, like these serendipitous kind of moments. So anyway, he's like, "Well, this is my stop," and he's like, "Hey, nice to meet you, young man. Thanks. I hope that book does for you what it did for me." And I say, "Hey, well, thanks so much for your time." And so he gets off. We shake hands, and I was kind of buzzing because had this is like kind of my first real like intellectual conversation, really with anyone, kind of, but especially with a black man.
Mhm.
So I got off the bus and I'm walking a few blocks back to my dad's house, and he says, "Oh, how was?" I said, "Yeah, it was great. I got these books." And I said, "Yeah, and I met this guy on the bus, and I'm telling him all about this story." And I could tell my dad, who'd always been pushing me to kind of get out of my suburban, provincial kind of white bubble. He was. I could tell he was excited that
Yeah.
I had had this conversation, almost as if he had somehow planned it, right? Like he was setting up. He's like, "Good, my little provincial white son is growing up, and he's having urban experiences, right?" So anyway, so I tell the story, and then I finish the story about this conversation. I said, "Yeah, and Dad, he was actually really smart."
And what did your dad say?
And he just his enthusiasm dampened a little bit. I could tell he was like, "Darn it," like here I here I was so excited that you're finally kind of coming into this world and understanding things and getting out of your sports and drinking and, kind of suburban mindset. And then you finish the story with that. And so I realized it too right away that I'd kind of, not that I'd made a mistake, but that I wasn't, like, there was a lot to learn. So I remember that story because, that was 23, 24 years ago. And it was really the beginning for me of like, wow, like this world I live in and the things I'm interested in, and the people I hang out with is very limiting, is very just so narrow in scope. And
Hmm.
so that experience really opened me up to like, man, I have a lot to learn. And so it wasn't like immediately I went out and just became this like,
Yeah.
but I started from then on kind of going like, okay, what do I not know? And like who I started recognizing the people and the communities and the context in which I was hanging out.
Yeah.
And I started to be more interested and more curious to explore and learn about more. And then a couple years later, my dad died. He was gay, as I said. He died of AIDS. That was in 2000. And that's when I moved up to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And that's when I really jumped into this work. I was a teacher. I taught a social justice curriculum. I was learning, immersing, all the things. So
I'm
it really,
sorry to hear your dad died. Can we talk about him a little bit?
yeah, no, I talk about him all the time, please.
Okay. Because I'm curious about him. He sounds like an awesome, really open person that he was.
Mhm.
And it sounds as if, he was encouraging you on the journey that you're on a little bit,
A
right? He was
hundred, a
excited
hundred,
for you to be on this journey.
yep, 100%. I mean, a white man, a gay white man. I mean, I know this. We're talking about race and anti-racism, and the LGBT community has its own kind of set of challenges, but there's so much overlap. There's so much, um, there's similar themes of marginalization and oppression
For sure.
and journeys. And so for me, being a cis straight white man, right, not having, you know, not being in the black community, not being in the LGBT community, I, in a way, I have the privilege of kind of looking at, any marginalized person, any marginalized kind of community, with an empathetic kind of and curious kind of perspective. How can I bring myself to this conversation, to this context, to this training, to whatever it is, in a way that's respectful, that's curious, that's open to learning and humble. And so that all that kind of stemmed from my dad trying to teach me. I mean, my parents were divorced. Well, actually, let me even back up. So my dad was born in 1949
Okay.
in Philadelphia,
Yeah.
so kind of East Coast, not too far from you.
Yeah.
And he tried to commit suicide in 19. He was 13, so 62, because he knew he was gay, but it's 1962 in Philadelphia. That's not a thing, right? To be
Right.
gay, right? So he's super smart. I mean, my reading kind of, and kind of intellectual interest stem from him.
Hmm.
So he had this like just this internal dilemma, right? Of who am I? What am I in the world? So anyway, he gets through high school. He goes to Emory University in Atlanta as a
Hmm.
freshman, and he gets kicked out because he tried to hit on his roommate, a male roommate. So this is 19. That would have been 66,
Wow.
right? 66, 67. So he tries to commit suicide again because he's like, what is this world, right? Who am I? I have these feelings. I can't identify them. I can't talk about them. It's illegal. It's all the things that, right?
Yeah.
And so he goes back to Philadelphia. He kind of darts around Temple. He goes to New York, the New School in New York, a few years, and then in 1970, right? So he turned 21 in March of 70. He gets connected with the Venceremos Brigade. I don't know if you've heard of the Venceremos
No.
Brigade. So this was a group. I think they were based out of Boston, and it was kind of like a cultural exchange slash political subversive group that would go down to Cuba and help Castro with the sugar harvests,
Hmm.
right? So it was, and as you probably know, at that time, you couldn't travel. You still can't travel from the United States to Cuba legally. So
Right.
they would go to Canada,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
Toronto or Montreal or Quebec or somewhere, and then they would fly down to to Cuba, and they. So he went down for like 3 months. In fact, he celebrated his 21st birthday in Cuba, and
Mhm.
they were working on the sugar harvest and doing the whole thing. So anyway, he comes. So he's like a young hippie radical kind of guy, right? So he comes back after the trip, and he met a couple, a heterosexual couple, who were from Urbana, Illinois, which is a small. It's where University of Illinois is. So he comes back to the States with them, and he's kind of halfway through college, no obligations. So he's like, yeah, I'll come back and hang out with you guys. So he comes back, and he's in this small college town, and that couple had a small son who this woman who was a senior in high school was the babysitter for. And so my dad, who wasn't my dad yet,
Yeah.
met this woman who you can probably guess wasn't my mom yet, but was going to be my mom. And they got together, and as soon as she graduated high school a semester early, she's still 17. They get the heck out of there because she's tired of her home life.
Okay.
So they go and they move to Mexico, and they get married, and then
Wow.
I'm born. So
Wow.
I'm born, and then
Born in
obviously
Mexico.
I was born in Albuquerque, right? My dad went to UNM. He graduated, and then we moved to San Diego, shortly after that. And
Mhm.
then by the time I don't think I was even two. My parents got divorced because my dad finally, 1974, 5, was like, hey, I'm gay. Um, it's no longer pathologized. In 1973, the year I was born,
Right.
it was the APA pathologized homosexuality.
Yes.
So anyway, I mean I know it's kind of a long backstory, but I think that whole story, like I wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for inequity. If my dad could have been who he was from the beginning, he wouldn't have married my mom,
Right.
right? Because he knew he was gay, but that's what you do. You marry a woman because that's what you do in 1971, right?
Yeah.
And so and then I'm born, and there you go. And
But when did
so
you know your dad was gay?
interestingly, I was 14.
Okay.
Um, so, and it's interesting because now I have kids and I've been a teacher, and it's a different era, and I live, it's just a different time, right?
Right.
So I think my mom and dad they were worried about when and how to tell me.
Hmm.
And so I guess, and I've talked to my mom about this probably about 10 years ago. We were talking about this, like that they had agreed, like they would talk. They were amicable. It wasn't like this big nasty divorce or anything. It was just kind of, well, you're gay. Like, I guess we shouldn't be married, right?
Right.
so, so anyway, they have this agreement that they're just going to talk and kind of find the best time to tell me, right? And this is the 70s, 80s, Reagan's president. AIDS has launched, and I mean, Reagan was probably the worst possible person to be the president during the launch of AIDS. I mean, the most homophobic denier. I mean, I could go on a big rant soapbox about Reagan, but I won't. So anyway, 1988, I was a freshman in high school. I was almost 15, and I'm visiting my dad in San Francisco, and
Oh, so your
he's
parents are already separated. You
oh
said
yeah.
they separated 2 years old, but you don't know he's gay yet. You don't.
No,
You
don't
probably
know his
too
name.
young.
He lived in San Diego for till I was 5. Then he moved to LA till I was about 11. Then when I was 11, he moved to San Francisco. So I'm coming up to San Francisco as a middle schooler, like, wow, this is cool. Like San Francisco, like it's such a cool city and everything, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm 14, and it was always we had a good relationship, but it's like my dad. It's like I see him 3, 4, 5 times a year, and you know, and and he always used to tease me because the town I grew up in was called El Cajon,
Hmm.
and it translates as like the square, the box, the coffin, right? All these, which is very very apt. So anyway, his whole line was like, Jared, there's more to life than El Cajon. So he'd kind of tease me, like I'd come into San Francisco and there are all these great things and restaurants and stuff, and I'm like, Dad, can we go to McDonald's? Like, Jared, like there's more to life than El Cajon, like So that was kind of the joke, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, he sits me down. I'm about to fly back to San Diego, and he says, I got to tell you something. And I figured it was going to be one of those like, hey, I love you, I miss you, I wish we could spend more, those types of things. And he says, Tom is my friend. I'm like, okay, yeah, I figured Tom's your friend, I know him. And John John is my boyfriend. I'm gay.
Just like that, he tells you.
Yeah. And so I'm in this small. I know exactly where the apartment is on Page Street, right off of Divisadero. It's like in the Haight district, and like that that was so frightening to me. I mean, talk about the most homophobic age, 14.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so anyway, so yeah, so that
You lived in something called the Haight District.
yeah, so the Haight. I don't know Haight Ashbury. I don't know if
Okay.
it's yeah. So Haight Haight. Haight
Okay.
Street is a main street. There's Lower Haight and there's Upper Haight.
Okay. Okay.
So he was kind of actually right in
I got a
between.
gay man in the Haight District. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it was famous like in the '60s for like the Grateful Dead and the kind of the hippie Summer of Love, all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's it's an interesting neighborhood. I'll say that. It's gone through some changes over the decades.
So,
But anyway, yeah. So that now I have this burden.
right.
That's how I looked at it. Not like, oh, cool. Like, what's this mean? It was like, I'm embarrassed. So I go back to San Diego and I don't tell anyone my whole high school, life because my dad's in San Francisco. No one knows him,
Hmm.
right? So I go back and I have my straight, white, athletic, kind of existence. And then I finally tell someone when I'm 20 that my best friend, I say, hey, my dad's gay. She's like, big deal. I'm like, oh, really? Right. So that started to open things up. And then the story I told on the bus was a couple years later. So what the theme is and why it kind of uh, matters now to my work is the themes are I was in a place of privilege well, I still am, but for so long of being white, being straight, being, middle class, like all these things that I could choose, for example, not to tell anyone that my dad was gay.
Hmm.
I had, I could probably, 10 people from the age of 1 to 25, uh, people of color who I was friends with. And I think that's the experience for, I would say, most white people, right? And
Yeah.
so as I'm getting into the 20s and I have this experience on the bus and my dad's starting to really, I'm starting to hang out with him more and appreciate San Francisco more and like see like, oh yeah, I don't want to like live in this like suburb with all white people with nothing to do and no political, cultural, social awareness. Like I started to shift, right?
Hmm.
And so, but it wasn't until my dad died when I was 27 that I finally like, you know, actualized that shift. And that's when I moved to San Francisco
Yep.
and that I don't want to be that guy anymore. Like it was very intentional. So I don't want to be, I was a college athlete,
Right.
like the whole thing, my life was sports and drinking and, superficiality. And I'm like, you know what? I don't want to be that guy anymore. And I can choose. Like there's this meta awakening. And so I had a lot to learn and I set to learning. And that was 20 years ago. And that's still the path I'm on.
I'm so amazed. And I'm thinking to myself that your journey toward anti-racism is totally due in part to the fact that your father, um, you had to become open to accepting who your dad was, first and
Hmm.
foremost, as a marginalized gay man. And I'm sure that
Yeah,
that deep appreciation allows you to lend itself to have the empathy required, for other marginalized communities as well.
exactly. I mean, that's exactly it. What I realized when, that mid to late 20s, as I was deciding to and then moving up to San Francisco and really jumping into the work was that whether it be I was missing out on so much humanity,
Hmm.
and not from like a charity or philanthropic or altruistic thing, like oh these poor black people or these poor gay people. It wasn't that. It was like up to this point in my life, it was unconsciously and probably a lot of consciously, but like I'm not going to go hang out with that group of people, not because I think they're bad or they're mean but it's like they're just like, why would I? Like,
Right.
these are my people, right? And so you see that so often in you know kind of non-malicious ways.
Hmm.
You see it all the time in corporation, in neighborhoods, in politics. I mean, just that's kind of how people are. And so
Right.
what I've set to do back then, and I still do this, is like I'm going to intentionally be very intentional about uh, who I choose to hang out with, who I choose to explore friendships and relationships with, who, be very mindful of who am I hanging out with on a regular basis.
Right.
And again, not in a savior, it's like, but just because it stems from curiosity. Like
Yeah.
I was so incurious for 25 years, and I didn't want to be that way anymore. So, um, yeah, so that's, I think, I think I'm effective at doing this work
Hmm.
because I know that my journey of where, what I've just kind of captured, like where I was and how I've evolved to kind of where I am
Hmm.
is very similar and parallel to probably most white people's experience.
Yeah.
And they're somewhere on that journey, probably most often back kind of where I was, 20 years ago.
So tell me about the work then. What do you do in your practice to cause people to wake up? Is it just giving them the tools and the resources to have the awakening? Are you reading books? Is it like book club meetings and all that kind of stuff, or what's happening?
Yeah, mostly it's so I center storytelling and narrative.
Hmm.
It's really at its heart, it's EQ work. It's emotional intelligence work.
Hmm.
It's sharing it's being vulnerable, it's modeling vulnerability, and it's helping people. I really prefer kind of the one-on-one work because that's where you can just, it's almost like therapy. I'm not a therapist. I
Yeah.
don't I don't have my therapy license, but in a way it's okay. You're you're newly interested in waking up for whatever reason. It's it's interesting. It seems like a lot of white people think, George Floyd was the first, black person, murdered by the police.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
kind of,
No, no, you're
disappointed,
so right.
right? It's like, but okay, well, hey, you're here now. Where have you been the last 425 years, right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
but you're here now. Okay, great. So, and the thing is, well, I'm newly aware that systemic racism and all these things that you and I know because we live it and we know it and we study it and this is our work, right?
Hmm.
But they're new to it, so they're like, oh my gosh, like, and they're almost like overwhelmed with this new awareness.
Yeah.
And so I try to uh, help them understand that and embody their narrative, their story, and help them. Everyone's like, what should I do? What can I do? Right? And I don't know if you know Resma Menakem. He's a black man from Minneapolis actually, and he does a lot of work on like racial trauma, intergenerational trauma. And he's like, white people always want the strategy. They always want to know what to do. He's like, it's not about what you're gonna do. It's about who you're gonna be.
Yes.
Right? And so I rarely give people like to dos and to don'ts.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I had somebody last night. I did a book club session last night, and then I had somebody ask me, you know, what do we do? What can we do? And I was tempted to just be like, you could do this, 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 but I was like, no, we will talk about just, you know, you could be an active anti-racist, right? You can take actions in your spheres of influence. You can have conversations, and stop, the racist rhetoric when you hear it, right? Like call out microaggressions. There are small things,
mhm.
but yeah, there's a whole list of big things that people could do, but I'm not going to give it to them, right? Like they have to, on the journey, figure that out.
Well, exactly. So, yeah. Oh, you could, if you're in next time you're in a meeting and the white boss, interrupts the black woman, you could call that out. Oh,
Right.
okay. So call out black, white boss, right? So okay, so maybe that person goes and does that, and
Yeah.
maybe it's impactful, and the young black woman says, "Hey, thank you for doing that. That made a lot. Great, awesome. Like keep." But if that's not something that's like part of who you are, you're gonna do that once or maybe 5 times or this, and then but you're gonna it's not gonna seep into who you are.
Yeah.
So that's when he says, Resma says, like, who do you want to be? Like, you got to hang out and do this work with other white people for like 3 to 10 years. And so when you say that to white people, like, oh, I thought like, well, I have empathy for George Floyd, and now I understand black people are marginalized, and you mean I have to think about it like every day for 10 years,
Yeah.
right? Then that defaults to their privilege and their complacency, and then they don't. So it really is a commitment,
Yeah.
and that's what people don't understand. And so what I try and help them do is challenge them in a way that doesn't scare them off, but
Hmm.
that also doesn't sugarcoat. Like I'm not an expert. I'm a white guy like you. I'm not an expert in race or race relations or right. I just happen to be very interested and curious, and have done a lot of work on myself
Yes.
and done a lot of reading and listening and learning and immersing for 20 years.
Yeah.
And so I feel, and do I still have privilege? Heck yeah. Do I make mistakes all the time? Am I hypocritical all the time? Right? Is most of my network still white? Yes.
Hmm.
Right? So all these things, like, I think people get caught up in like the details, and then it's too overwhelming, and they go, oh, forget it.
Yeah. 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 It's
And so,
small changes, right? You don't have to do anything ginormous. It's just small, subtle changes, right?
yeah, it's little things like, I mean, I was just doing, just Wednesday, I finished a presentation for a client, and we were talking about uh, the difference between like it's a nonprofit that works with a lot of youth of color, a
Hmm.
big national organization, and the difference between charity work and liberation work.
Mm.
So some of these they come from like a philanthropic, charitable perspective, like, oh, we're saving the little black kids of the ghetto,
Yeah.
right? That kind of. So you have these, white program staff and white executive directors of these agencies and stuff, and they're coming in like, well, we have to save the black kids, so go in and do. And then you have these relationships, that are, I don't want to say they're meaningless, because it's not like all to waste, but they're not optimizing the opportunity to change the dynamic,
Right.
right? Because they're seeing it as a charity, like, oh, I'm the white person who comes in, I have privilege, and so they have a little bit of that recognition,
Yeah.
but they're not coming in like, hey, I'm with you, I want to understand, and I'm in this with you, and your liberation is linked up with mine, and that's hard for white folks to do. So I try and help them um, look at their narrative, like I've shared with you, kind of mine, like, what is your racism story, what is your anti-racism story.
Yes.
And the reason that's hard for most white people is they probably haven't thought about it much,
Yes.
and then when they go look back at their, well, let's see, I don't know, I don't really have one,
Yeah.
because most of the stories are actually non-stories.
You know what I like to do? I like to challenge white people to think about the first time they knew they were white, right?
Yeah.
Like Black people or people of color in general, we always have a moment where we are racialized,
Yep.
right? And then we know that we are not in the majority, right? So
Mhm.
similarly, I'm sure there's going to be a moment where white people, they know that I'm white, that I'm privileged, that I'm in power, that I'm in the majority. And what was that moment? It's typically in childhood, right? Really young, 4 or 5 years old. Somebody's got a story where they're either the bully or they're the one being bullied, right? Or something happens, and it allows them to kind of process. Yeah,
Okay.
I do see color. I've seen my own color. I've seen my own privilege.
Yeah.
It does allow them to kind of have that aha moment.
Yeah, and they have to go there. That's vulnerable, and that's
Mhm.
scary. And I'm saying that not to defend, or to, but I think just to recognize that's why white people don't do that work. Because if I go, oh gosh, yeah, when I was 5 years old, and that little black kid, and I, you know, hit him on the playground, and I said blah blah, like that takes, you know, like no one wants to admit like they're racist, right? I mean, well,
No,
some people
no,
do, but most white people don't, right?
no. They
And
want to be, of
so
course, they're good and pure and altruistic and
exactly.
never do anything wrong.
And so that's what I try and help people. So like my intersection, the anti-racism work is like this EQ side, right? This emotional intelligence, empathy, vulnerability,
Yeah.
curiosity, those types of things. But also, like you got to know your narrative. So like obviously I've shared with you, a large kind of you can probably picture my through line, right?
Yeah.
So I've done that work for myself. So now I can go back and go, oh yeah, like my I remember there's this kid named Langston who I
Hmm.
played with in first grade, I think, first, second, third grade
Yeah.
at school. He was the only black kid in the
Hmm.
whole school that I remember. Maybe there are others, but he was my one kind of interaction with a black person,
Right.
and we got along fine. And we played soccer at recess or whatever. But I never invited him over to my house, and it wasn't like no, I would never. It was just kind of like no, like why would I do that? He's black.
Yeah.
And so I think for white people, everyone's got stories like that. But until you actually start looking at it and exploring it, it doesn't feel like a story, right? And I think that's the challenge is the stories are actually non-stories.
Yeah.
Like like there was no I don't have any stories from my childhood. Even the story that I just let off with the man on the bus, that's not really like unless you really think about it and look into it and dive into the nuance of it, it's not like it might not seem like a story,
Yeah.
but it is. And so it's really helping people with like, well, what is a story? Right? It's where you have some sort of internal dilemma and you're here and you have this dilemma and you're trying to figure out what to do and then you figure out what to do and then something, you're different afterwards.
Yes.
And so that's what I try and help white people like how have you changed or if you haven't changed that much how do you want to change and what are you going to do.
It's really about
How
the
do you see?
transformation.
Yeah, it is. And so
Mhm.
you know it's it's slow work, but I think it's important work.
I agree wholeheartedly, Jared. I think we need more people like yourself doing this work. Otherwise, we're gonna have more incidents like George Floyd, like Ahmaud Arbery. I said to somebody again last night, um, because again, they thought George Floyd was just, the first and only. And I said, he's just one of many that were caught on camera because we all have cell phones now, right? This has been ongoing for decades and decades and decades and decades and decades. And it's nothing new to our
Yeah,
community, right? So unless we do something different, we're still going to be having the conversation about, unpacking the invisible knapsack, the next police shooting, then like something drastic has to change. And it starts at an individual level, but also systems have to change as well, right?
yeah. It's interesting you bring up that dynamic because I fully understand
Hmm.
and appreciate and agree with that it's systemic. I mean, if you've read, Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, Nell Painter wrote The History of White People. Like whiteness, even the idea of whiteness is a made up thing, right? And
Hmm.
obviously, it's super relevant, so we can't ignore it now. But in its inception, it was a made up thing that has created political, social, legal, institutional systems
Hmm.
that are upholding white supremacy. So I
Yeah.
100% agree with that. And it's people, individuals who create and have power to sustain
Hmm.
uh, systems.
Yes.
So sometimes I get into I wouldn't say arguments, but discussions where like, because I focus on individuals. That's just where my energy is and where my motivation is to work. As I said earlier, like we're working one on one or with small groups, right? And they say, well, yeah, if you're just doing that and you're not focusing on the system, like it's never going to change. Like, why is it an either or? It's a both
Mhm.
and.
Yeah.
So if I can reach someone with a lot of power and influence on an individual level who has the ability, if if they choose to change the system,
Yeah,
to impact or affect in a positive way the system, then you see the correlation of individual and systemic. So I think that's really important, in the in this discussion around, like, it's not an either or. Both are very relevant and very important to be continually addressing.
for sure. So what's your family life like now? Is your wife and your kids, are they all anti-racist like you?
Yes, yes, and maybe. I
Yeah.
think, again, Dr. Kindy's, How to Be an Anti-Racist book was really important in my continuing understanding and evolution of what anti-racist means, what racist means.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he
Oh
defines,
yeah.
they're like, we think of racist, and racism is such this evil bad word,
Mm.
and no one wants to be associated with it. But it's actually a neutral term, right? So it's, if you're doing something racist, it's, you're supporting some sort of hierarchical, thing between races. So it could, and so rather than say, like, oh, you're a racist, or you're not a racist, it's like that thing you did, or that the way you just expressed that thought was racist. So when you look at that, like, they're not fixed identities. So you ask, is my family anti-racist? I think so. And I think one of the most anti-racist things you can do is to recognize and admit when you are being racist.
Yes.
And so, my kids, I have 11-year-old twins, sixth grade. They're pretty smart, if I say so myself, right? So, but they're also two white kids,
Yeah.
so I think the continual work for me is to help them, uh, understand where they sit in the world, in their neighborhood, in their school, in their community, in political and social spheres, to have them continually be aware of that, because, kids and adults can just get like, oh, my norm is the norm, and, something else comes in and goes, like, it challenges that, and the first reaction is to act defensively or to dismiss it.
Have
And
they
so
seen the George Floyd killing?
they haven't.
No.
Um, they haven't seen the video. They know about it. They know about Ahmaud Arbery. They know about Breonna Taylor.
Yeah.
So we talk about these things. It's not
Yeah.
like we don't talk about them. My wife she works in a hospital, as a physical therapist. She's
Mhm.
at home now. She's more on the administrative side. So she, her work in San Francisco is very, uh, does a lot of, spinal cord injury, brain injury from gunshot wounds, gang related. So, like, we're in, the where we live and the work we do is, uh, it's just inherently going to have spark these conversations at home between us as adults, but also with the kids.
Right.
So it's something we talk about regularly. What's going on in the news? What's going on? As we're recording, election day, in the United States is, Tuesday, 3-4 days from now.
Yeah.
So, they're very. I have to make sure to not be. I have to find that balance. Okay, they're 11, and I want them to be woke and
Mhm.
understand. And, um, I know from my own experience as an 11-year-old, like, you can't just bang them over the head. They're not going to. They're not going to receive it.
Yes. So what are you doing? Are you just putting like creating a diverse environment with books and just leaving it out and letting them explore?
We have very open conversations. They're in a school that has a social justice curriculum, actually, where I used to teach when I was a teacher. So they're in that environment. We live in Oakland, which, obviously with the pandemic, we're not out and about as much as we
Yeah.
normally would be, but they have lots of, diversity in their circles,
Mhm.
friendship, and in our circles. Yeah, I mean, we talk about, we at dinner table, hey guys, there was another, just this week, black man shot in Philadelphia. So we're talking about that. So we're trying to normalize the conversation, and
Yeah.
to help them realize that their norm, as I said a few minutes ago, isn't the norm. Like, just so they're aware, because what happens with whiteness is that we go through our lives, hearing of things and stuff, but it's kind of out there. It's those people or it's that neighborhood, and then we don't really think about it much or do
Mhm.
anything about it,
Mhm.
and then it just persists. So I'm trying to normalize, like, we have to have these conversations, but not in a, like, now dad's got to come down and tell you a story, not like that kind of authoritative or pedantic or
Yeah.
professorial, but just like, hey guys, and I talk about, like, hey, they know the work I do, so, hey guys, I'm really kind of bummed out, like, lately, because another black man was shot by police, and what do you think? And so trying to draw them into the conversations, without being, as I said, kind of like, you obey me, I'm your dad, you have to think
Yeah.
exactly what I
Because of
think.
course, if you don't talk to them about it, they're going to go to school or wherever, and they're going to hear about it, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So are they bringing home black friends and
Well, not really, mostly because, well, they haven't been at school for 8 months.
oh, they're still at home right now?
Yeah, they're still at home, but yeah, they have black friends, and you know, but it's, yeah, so yes, they do, but it's not. I want to be clear, back to, like, kind of the savior and the tokenizing, that we don't say, like, oh, like, who are your friends? Like, oh, you should hang out with the black kid, and, like, right. So it's that balance of, not forcing it, but again normalizing it, and
Yeah.
um, helping them understand that as they're considering friendships and relationships, to be more open
Yeah.
than they're than they might otherwise be.
It's so interesting because the inverse is almost true for black families, right? Like my son, his best friend is white, and we have white friends come over and they've been at birthday parties and, our christenings and all of that, right? But
Hmm.
I have to like force him sometimes to like see the black friend or to pick up the black book or to, you know, well, what about her? She's cute, right?
I do some of that, and I try and find that balance of suggesting, of
Yeah.
offering a new opportunity, perspective, without forcing, because
Yeah. I don't
you know
force it, but my son, he knows that it's important to mommy that he sees his black skin, right? Like I remember when he was really little, he's 7 now, and he came and he's like, I'm brown. I said, no, 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 no. You're not brown, right? Yes, your skin might look brown, but we're called black, right? And then, I start getting all like, we got to get the Rosa Parks book in here. Like it's for kids, right? Like there's, we read like Maya Angelou and Rosa Parks, and he reads about like Malcolm X and he's got this book called Malcolm Little, all about when Malcolm X was a little boy. But I started to do that because I thought, oh no, like my kid thinks he's brown, am I failing, right? And
yeah,
so I go like 150% overboard. And now, he says things to me and then I can tell, poor thing, he's like looking for approval. Like, is it okay? It's like it's okay. Like, you know,
yeah, yeah,
mommy, and they're black too. And I'm like, that's okay. They could have been white, like I don't want him to misunderstand, why I'm introducing all that other stuff. Like I do want him to be exposed to diversity, and not
yeah,
just black and white, but to, other cultures as well. We're in a very, very multicultural city. Oakland, I think is one.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've only been to Toronto once for like 2 days. It was a work gig, so I'm not super familiar with it. But yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean, that's why we live here in
Yeah.
Oakland. I mean, even before we had kids, like, um, I want that environment for myself, for my family, for partly for selfish reasons, right? Like, there's just it's more interesting. There's more, you know, better food. I mean, it's like,
Exactly.
so it's like, but then you just get that again. It goes back to that humanity. Like, I don't want to, I don't want to close off for myself or my family, all the potential of humanity. And if you live in a very sheltered, homogenous way and place, that's white people are fine with that, and I'm not.
Well, I think you're doing great work, and that you should continue to do that, personally and professionally, and just keep doing what you're doing. I'm going to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story with me, telling your
Yeah.
personal journey. I really appreciate it. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, it's jaredkarol.com. That's Jared, Jared, Carol with a K, Karol.com. And he's also on LinkedIn, where we connected. And you can reach me at allthingsequitable.ca, or on Twitter at JB_equitable. And I look forward to having you on again, Jared, perhaps one day. And
Yeah, I would love it.
that would be great. I would love you to come back. And we'll see you on another episode. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Janelle. I appreciate you.
Thank you for coming on, Jared.